chat right now. We got
different. So there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of noise.
Why is everybody in slow motion?
Without further ado, let's bring on Chris. Further ado. So without further ado, but without further ado, let's bring on Lori. Hey H, you're muted, man. I can't hear you.
Oh, damn it. Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Your big return, and you're muted right off the bat.
I know, right? Exactly. In a different setup today than we are used to.
Yeah, we're gonna try this out and try a little new thing, and that's what we like to do recently with these lives. So hopefully everybody enjoyed last month's. H was in the crowd as well. What did you think of growing buds without you in February, H?
Well, I think you guys did a great job. I was like, why am I even here in the first place? But no.
Well, at one point it was like, why am I here? Because Scott and Mike were getting along so great, and it was just running the back end. So
I know. No, it was awesome. I was I just finished surgery. I was all drugged up still, having a great time in the background, and yeah, it was great. I mean, that's why I didn't show up in the first place, but I thoroughly enjoyed it.
yeah, so you're back to full health now?
Back to full health now. Still can carry much weight, but yeah, so far so good.
So nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
I
can't lift that much.
Yeah, exactly. Well, for those of you who weren't here last month, we had Scott Golem on, and he taught us a little bit about genetics and how to actually make your own genetics. And we shortened up that episode for everybody, edited it up, and re-uploaded it to YouTube so that you can get just that information on how to make your own genetics. If that's something you want to try this year, go ahead. If you are going to be growing males, maybe try to make sure it's an indoor grow so you don't ruin everybody else's outdoor season with that pollen, because as we know, it can spread quite far. But H, is that something you've ever considered, trying yourself? I know we love our seedsman genetics, and we're pretty happy with just growing their seeds, but always cool to experiment with things.
Yeah, I have thought about genetics before, and then I learned about it at agrocollege and how long it takes to stabilize a genetic and how much work goes into it and how many, samples of plants you really need to be able to do that. And it's an operation, to be able to do it properly. And so I figured, you know what, if I'm going to do something, I really want to go like all the way. So instead, I'm going to figure out how to do this, indoor growing automated system, which turns out to be great because after having a kid, now everything is on automatic mode. And I'm looking into different types of things, like different types of feeds, maybe grow some organic. So kind of delve into a different side of growing. But the genetic side, I love to watch it. I love to try different genetics, especially the ones that Season's have been coming out with, and leave it the genetics at that stage.
Leave it to the professionals like Scott. Well, because of popular demand, which I'm sure you saw in the comments last time, we've brought Scott back. So I'm going to bring him on right now. Scott, welcome back again.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Thanks for having me back. I'm excited to be here.
I'm sure the chat is very excited to have you back as well. And today we're gonna be switching up the topics a little bit to feeding and watering, because that's we've got lots of articles on BudTrainer.com on the basics, how to plant, transplant, train, obviously, top, harvest, cure. But one very important thing is feeding and watering, and we don't really have a lot of information on that. Obviously, there's tons of different options for nutrients, some basic principles that they all abide by so that your plants are nice and healthy, but not something that we've had a chance to really dive in on. And training your plant's not going to matter too much if you're not feeding it properly, right? So
Exactly.
I know that's one of the big things that we get on our training posts online, talking about how we can increase yields through training. People are like, well, if your environment, blah, 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 and they start talking about lights and feeding, and like, we're assuming you're doing that properly to start with so that the training's effective.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I remember
So,
with feeding, and especially with nutrients, the first year that I ever grew, I just put the plants in the ground and didn't think about feeding any fertilizer at all. I remember going to Home Depot one time and be like, "Oh, what should I put on my cannabis plants?" And the lady was like, "Oh, I heard that tomato nutrients are good for that." And I'm like, "Oh, I went and looked for tomato nutrients, but I couldn't really find anything specific. Ended up just letting nature do its thing, right? It wasn't a very big yield by any means. And then the year after, I did a lot more research and bought like a kit that was just like a veg, salt-based nutrient. There was some mycorrhiza there as well for you to put in the seedling stage, and then they had the flowering one, which I still planted them on the ground, but I was feeding that nutrient over top, and the yields were like definitely much more significant. But it's just funny going from like when you're a beginner, you don't even know that there's such a thing like fertilizers for cannabis. You go to Home Depot and you ask for it, and they tell you to use like tomato nutrients,
Yeah, there's a very wide variety of nutrients, especially when you look at kind of the cannabis space specifically. If you ever go into like a grow shop, you know what I mean? It's a little overwhelming, especially for beginners. You walk in and like, wow, there's a million things I can choose. Where do I start? What does what? You know what I mean? And it really kind of, there's a lot of options, which is great when you're advanced and very overwhelming as a beginner.
Yeah,
yeah.
and
So go ahead, H.
no, I was gonna say that as a beginner too, you want like simplicity, right? And then if you see that barrage of nutrients and you're like, oh, I can add everything. And we've seen so many cases of beginner growers that are just overfeeding their plants so much. There's some nutrient lockout going on there. The EC is at like 5 because it's just like, oh no, but they said add this much of this plus that much of that plus that much of that, and it just keeps piling up, right? So it's kind of like, I feel like we all learn our lessons where like less is more in cannabis growing. Mine was particularly with like lights. I used to just crank my lights and then my leaves would get burned because they were too young, although the nutrient side never too much. But then you get other folks that just want to put every single amendment that they sell at the store. You know what I mean? They walk out of there with like the whole 15 kit.
Definitely, yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, there's a lot
Yeah, I
out
mean,
there.
when I first met H2, like he was mixing his own salts. So not even going for like an advanced bottled nutrient or even just like a mix of salts. Like he was getting the N, the P, and the K separately and had his charts and was mixing it around. And how long did you keep that up until you were like, yeah, this is a little bit too much for growing 4 plants at home?
well, when I first learned about how to mix your own nutrients at agri-college, I was just like, whoa, you know what I mean? I can buy these so cheap. And I started mixing them and they were so cheap. But I was growing multiple strains at the time. And what I didn't know at the time, I had just moved into the place where my plants are today. And the water was softened. And for 1 year, I tried to mix my own nutrients, but always getting nutrient deficiency. I was always trying to change the formula a little bit, every single time getting nutrient deficiency. I'm like, what the hell? I tried the exact formula from agri-college. Why is it not working with my plants? And then I realized that the water or the salts from the soft water were pretty much worse than the salts just from the city, which is calcium and magnesium pretty much, right? So I started using just regular calcium magnesium water. By that point, I had already gone through like 15 different formulas trying to mix my own nutrients. So I did a few more batches, but I was just so fed up at that point because I also didn't have to mix that much that often, So every time I needed to mix nutrients, I had to open 6 of those salts, you know what I mean? And then put a little bit of each, and I had to use a scale super precise to make sure that I had the right amount, So it was more work as a small grower, like just, growing medicinally at home to mix my own nutrients, even though it was much cheaper than to just get a nutrient set that is quicker to do. You know what I mean? So like, that's the thing about fertilizers, that we all need them, but we don't want to spend time, mixing them. I at least don't know of anyone who has fun mixing salt-based nutrients, maybe organically because there's more of an art to it, but like mixing salt-based nutrients is one of my worst chores, you know.
Yeah, it's very very advanced when you start mixing salt-based fertilizers by yourself. And again, it's typically more to large-scale growers, just because one, it's very difficult to buy fertilizer salts in their individual form, just because ammonium nitrate and things like that can be used for bombs. So you can't just regularly go in and buy certain components that you would be able to buy as a greenhouse. So that's where I think that the grow stores and just the ones that are available are a lot simpler for most people to use, and just probably the more efficient way for any kind of home grower. And you kind of tweak from there with the different supplements you want to add in. And like I said, there's tons of variety of things out there that you can get off the shelf to kind of add in and tweak that design and just play around and see what works best for you and your grow.
Yeah, that's the
like
thing.
we were chatting a bit before, there's different categories here and different ways of feeding and watering your plants. So we've got growers in the chat who are growing in soil, some of them organic growers. I myself love cocoa, Age loves peat moss, which are both not hydroponic methods, but getting a little bit closer to that. And then you have the full deep water culture. So I think what would be cool if we could go through before we kind of just get off on our tangents, which we will get to for sure, is kind of focusing on tips for those different segments. And I think one of the questions we used to get a lot, H, is should I be feeding my plants every watering? So maybe that'd be a good place to start. Is like, what's the difference between watering and feeding, and where do those apply? If you want to start off, Scott.
Yeah, so with a lot of plants, like household plants, things like that, you typically wouldn't want to feed necessarily every time you water. When we start talking about cannabis, they are typically very heavy feeders. So a lot of the times you can get away with whatever media you're looking at, giving it a water each time. Really, the big thing that comes into is kind of the strength of fertilizer that you want to give them during each watering is the one thing you have to keep in mind a little bit, especially when you think about what it is that you're kind of growing in and what that media is. So if we're going to something like rock wool or cocoa, peat moss, deep water culture, you kind of play around with them a little bit differently, and they do have kind of a little bit of different nuances between all of them.
Interesting.
Why did you go with peat moss?
Well, I think because with cocoa, I had a lot of nutrient buildup issues, and I had to, I guess, run more runoff. So when I used to have kind of like you have, Kurt, that big 4x4 tray that catches runoff, and like Mike already also has in his 5x5 tent, that's easier because you have all of your pots in one big tray. They all run off. You have, those things that come to that one compartment, and you can just suck that water out, right? So that was a lot easier. But then with soil, I realized you don't have to have as much runoff. Of course, you have to feed it at a lower EC as well, but the buildup didn't happen as much. So what I do now is every 2 weeks or so, I water my plants to runoff. I get, so I use the Bud Pots 3 gallon, which is like this size right here. And the trays that I use are actually, I have one right here, just a little bit bigger than the pot. So the pot just fits inside of there. There's also a little elevator that I put in. So the pot is pretty much flush with the edge of the tray, right? So I can get about 2 liters or half a gallon of water inside of this tray here before it's touching the bottom of the pot. So then what I typically do is I'll just go water it to runoff, get about 1 liter or 2 of runoff. So really wash it off. And then I pull that tray out from underneath and I slide another clean one under so that I can, that water doesn't sit under the pot there and I don't risk those roots kind of growing out of the pot. So that's kind of what the peat has allowed me to do. Whereas I find like with cocoa, waiting 2 weeks, and sometimes I'll wait as much as 3 weeks, especially during flower. They're consuming a lot of nutrients. I don't have to do the runoff much. It's more so during veg and switching into flower when the nutrients are really changing. But during that late flower, I just, taper off on the nutrients. Don't need much runoff. I pay attention to the tips of the leaves. If they're not burning, I don't need to wash it off much. So I just find that the peat is more forgiving than the cocoa. I don't know, Scott, if that's just my luck or if that actually is correct.
Yeah, I'd say when you look at kind of the different systems in general, I would say a peat perlite kind of mix, like a pro mix or something like that you typically find at a store, they are definitely the most forgiving. I'd say kind of the next most forgiving would probably be your coco coir. And then if you're going for Rockwell, that's where it gets a little bit more finicky. And if things go wrong, they go wrong a lot faster.
Yeah,
When we talk about a system like deep water culture, for those that aren't familiar, is basically you're not using any media. You're just growing the roots. They're just fully submerged in water. If you can keep your pH and your nutrients in the right level, that system is kind of like a set and forget, for lack of better words. You can't overwater because you already have tons of water on the roots. You just got to make sure you watch the oxygen level that's in the water with an air stone.
Ah,
Sure.
that makes sense. And how if you screw up, you see that screw up a lot faster too, right? Like
Yes.
in deep water culture, if your nutrients are off by not so much, your plants would show in what, a matter of 48 hours.
Yeah, you usually see it depends on the nutrient deficiency, and that's kind of the weird part too, is that whenever we talk about nutrient deficiencies or things showing up in your plants, sometimes it can be within kind of 48, 72 hours kind of thing. Other ones will show up around like a week later. So it gets a little weird sometimes when you see a problem with your plant to be like, when did this happen? Because it may not have been, say, yesterday. You may
Yeah.
have had that problem for a while before it's visibly showing up to you.
So you talked about like the overwatering issue a little bit there. So, deep water culture, obviously the roots are sitting in water constantly. They've got the oxygen coming from that stone. But hypothetically, let's say you built one of those into your soil grow. Like, would that reduce the chances of you overwatering in soil? I know this is completely out of left field, but I was just like, obviously deep water culture, they're completely submerged all the time. They're still getting it through that secondary system.
Yeah, so again, the roots need oxygen to actually breathe and function. So when we're talking about soil, where they're getting that oxygen is from basically the little pore spaces that you have between the different soil particles. So especially when you look at something like a pro mix, and you're looking like the perlite, that'll be the little white balls that you see in there. What those are there is to basically help create air pockets and reduce compaction of that soil to allow the roots to kind of have that space to get that oxygen level. So if we were to add an air stone, say, into our soil, it might put air in and it's going to kind of bleed through whatever pathway it goes, but it's not necessarily going to work the same way as if it was fully submerged in water, because that air will only go in certain areas between those soil pockets.
Great point.
And what if you
Uh,
were to then, like to Curtis's question, like if you were to just continue always feeding oxygenated water, you know what I mean? So it's on this constant drip irrigation, getting that runoff and kind of recirculating, but then you're aerating the runoff, for example.
Yeah, so there have been a couple companies that I've kind of come across that have what they call like nano bubble technology, where it's like supposed to throw a lot of really, really micro bubbles into your irrigation water that they say will help with kind of growing bigger, better plants because you get that oxygen in the root zone. I personally haven't tried any of them yet. I'm curious too. I'd love to play around with one of those.
Yeah.
But the big thing is just making sure the media that you use, it really comes down to the soil blend, that it needs to have those kind of air pocket spaces or avoid that compaction. So if I went with something that is like, if we look at Pro Mix, it comes in a couple different formats that growers can use. So there's a BX one, and then there's an HP one typically. So HP is for high porosity. It has a lot more of that perlite than you do get with the other ones. So depending seasonally and how you want to grow, especially if you're growing outside, you might choose one or the other. So the HP has higher porosity. It's going to drain out a lot faster. It's not going to hold nearly as much water. So this works really well for if you're growing kind of inside, you need things to dry out, especially if it's kind of cooler climates, things like that. But when we put something like that outside in the summer, it's going to dry out a lot faster. So maybe you want the BX formula that has a little bit less of that perlite, a little bit more peat moss in it, so it's going to hold a little bit more of that water. It's going to resist drying out as quickly when you get a really hot sunny day in the like dead of summer.
No, that's interesting because I do use the HP both indoors and I've used it outdoors, and it does dry noticeably faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, H even got the automated drippers on his outdoor grow the last time he did it.
Oh yeah, every day they would get fed, but even then, like the sides of the pots would like hardly ever be wet because you would just dry it so quick.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's where when we talk about kind of how much do you want to water, how frequently, there's so many different factors that come into that with like what blend of soil you're using, you know what I mean? And there's a whole lot of variables. So it's kind of a case by case type of deal.
So what are some of the tips you would give to somebody for when to water? Like I know for cocoa, it's pretty consistent throughout, early flower, I'm probably already feeding at least once a day. You know, early veg, it's definitely a lot less than that. I can just pick up the pot and kind of feel how heavy that is compared to completely dry and completely wet. I know like soil, you can do a bit of a finger test, but what are some of like the tips you would give for somebody trying to dial it in so they're not overwatering it and also not kind of starving it as
Okay,
well?
so I think a lot of it really comes down to kind of the stage of growth that you're in, right? So the biggest thing I see most people do is when you first transplant a clone or you're starting a seed, is that people think like, oh, I need to water it every day so it doesn't die. The reality is you want to saturate that soil the first time so you're getting runoff. So if I'm going to plant a clone in say a 1 gallon pot or something like that, I'll plant the clone, I'll water till runoff comes out, and then I'm not going to water it until I see roots starting to come out the bottom of that pot in the little holes at the bottom. So essentially what we're trying to do in that initial stage is allow that soil to dry down, and the roots are going to go searching for water. So as they need to find water, that's what's going to force them to grow and kind of follow the water as that pot dries down. So this is a way of kind of getting that rapid root expansion like as quickly as we possibly can. Um, Once that's happened, you can kind of start watering it. To get a gauge of how much water you would need in a pot, and I've told people this, it depends how kind of scientific, how kind of hardcore you want to go on all these things. But if you take a pot and say I'm using a Pro Mix for my media, if you tape the holes on the bottom of your pot the first time before you have a plant in there, fill it all the way with water till it's fully saturated, and then pull that tape off the bottom to let that pot drain out. Let gravity drain that all out. That will give you an ideal weight once the water stops coming out of when this pot is holding as much water as it possibly can. This is what that pot feels like. When we're watering, I never want to aim for that kind of full saturation because again, we want the air pockets in that soil. But it gives you kind of a base point of like, this is a fully heavy pot, depending on what media you're using. So that way you can get a gauge for yourself. And if you want to go really advanced on this, this is where you can kind of weigh the pot beforehand. You put your water in, let all the water run out, and then you can see what's in there volume wise. So again, water is going to be about 1 milliliter is 1 gram, I believe it is, for the equivalency. So you can get an idea of how much water that whole pot holds once it's drained out. From there, you can kind of start kind of calculating, okay, if I want to say in a vegetative state, I'm going to try and saturate that pot to somewhere between 60 to 70% full saturation. And then I'm going to ideally let that dry down to about 60% before I add a bit more water. The big thing with the vegetative stage in general is that the more frequently you can apply water, the faster and more vegetative that plant pushes. So we're not looking for necessarily like a full dry down, oh, my pot's really dry now. And when we get to kind of the advanced stage, we're looking for kind of just minute differences. I want it to dry down, say 10%, rehydrate at 10%. And however many times I can do that during the day while the lights are on, that's how I'm going to kind of optimize that nutrient absorption and that growth speed on those plants. When we talk about getting into the flowering stage, you'll find that the roots aren't growing as much. Once that stretch is complete, the plant is kind of pretty much at the size that it's going to be. They don't drink nearly as much water at that point. This is where you want to let that dry down. Say instead of going up to 60 to 70% moisture content, I'm going to go somewhere in the 50 to 60% moisture content. And I want that to dry down somewhere between 30 to 40% before I bring up another watering and allow that to kind of saturate up again. This is going to force the plant on a generative thing. So it's going to put out more flowers, create more bulk for us, and put that energy into growing the flowers as opposed to trying to put on more vegetative growth like leaves and stems and side shoots that we don't necessarily want.
Okay, so there's a difference in optimal saturation in veg and in flower, and you would say going, what's that, 15-20% lower in flowers ideal.
Yes.
That's
So
very interesting
again,
because
that's where
I
if you
might
want to
be
get really,
overwatering then.
really, really advanced with it, like get out of
Yeah.
scale. You know what I mean? See what it
Yeah.
weighs when you get to full saturation, and then you can kind of see from there, like where is that? And as you go through more over time, you'll get a feel for when I lift a pot, you know, it's X amount of weight. And again, when I go through a greenhouse, especially when I'm doing large scale phenotyping, every plant is drinking a different amount. So I'm going through lifting the pot, being like, okay, I know it feels like this, so I'm going to add X amount of water to this pot. And the next one, oh, I only need a little bit, as this one needs more. And you just kind of get a feel over time. And it's a hard one to explain, but with the scale method, you can kind of really start to train your body. This is what that weight corresponds to in terms of a moisture content.
Very cool.
I definitely
Okay,
used the
so-
scale at one point when I had, my tray, and I used to mix my nutrients. And like you said, I would have sometimes the same strain in the tent, and they would be all drinking at different rates, and it would drive me nuts because it was hard with the drippers to like send more or less water to one or the other, right? So, yeah, definitely kind of like took it to the next level. But I am guilty sometimes of letting them dry a little bit too much. And I'm like, whoa, this feels like cardboard now, like there's nothing in here. And then you just soak them up again. And I feel like
you can't really see by the plant. Like it can be bone dry. I've had that with my cocoa runs, and it's perky. It looks super happy. And then you're like, this thing's probably an hour and a half or 2 hours away from being like almost dead, right? So it's actually a great topic to bring on another familiar face, because Mike is back, and Mike actually is doing another Bud Cups run, and actually has got some numbers to share with us directly about what you're speaking. So, Mike,
Awesome.
Welcome to the show, sir.
Welcome. Thanks. Hey, how's it going? Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy Friday.
Happy Friday.
This is a full
Yeah. This is, as you guys are talking, I'm like, put my hand up. I want to talk. I like Kurt. I'm definitely overwatering after hearing what you just said about the lower percentage in flower. And listen, I'm very, very new to cocoa. It's only my third run. I went from a 5-gallon to a 3-gallon to a 16-ounce Bud Cup. You know what I mean? So, and I've been trying to figure this out, and I've been talking to a bunch of people, and they're like, "Damn, that's super interesting. Well, I'm going to try something like that." So I am not very good at math. I throw that out there right now, and I get confused a lot of times. But the other day, I'm like, oh crap, I had the plant that was like already past that point, Kurt, where it was hanging over to the side. I'm like, oh no. And then because I'm cocoa, I had to slowly water it and get it resaturated. But I said at that point, I'm like, well, what is this 16-ounce Bud Cup that has cocoa, pure cocoa, and it's a 60 WHC? Maybe you know what that actually stands for. I always make something up. What is it, Scott? Do you know?
For the WHC?
Yeah.
Water holding capacity. Yeah.
Capacity.
I was going content too. That's what I thought. I was like, content. that sounded like a good one. But then same thing, right? But so I weighed the cup full of cocoa, dry, like zero moisture. Okay. And I have a number. And then I took that same one and I watered with what I'm watering with, and I got the cocoa completely saturated. So it was dripping out. It was wet to the top. So it was like the heaviest it was going to be. And then I pulled out my handy dandy little scale and I weighed the whole unit, and it had like the stand, the cup, and bone dry. It was 113 grams. Okay. And after watering it, it went up to 312. And I go, that's a fair bit.
Yeah.
200 grams of water in a small little Bud Cup, right? There are 16 ounces and at 60% cocoa. I'm like, okay. And then I'm trying to dial in the number, but this is where, and I'm still in veg, obviously. Not obviously, but I'm just little plants. I just got seedlings. I'm starting them. And I'm struggling now with, I think I was watering a bit too much, but everyone says you can't do it too much. But regardless, I think I've got it dialed in now. But I was curious, Scott, because I've done a lot of reading on a bunch of different sites, and there's a bunch of cool sites out there that I've found that trying to research cocoa. And when you say you want to go that 10%, what I've been doing, and whether it's the 5-gallon jug, whether it's the 3-gallon jug, or this now 16-ounce, I would water and catch it with a little tray and soak it up, and then I would, know how much I was like, so that's about 30%. Perfect. Or 20%, and then I would want to dry back to 30, but it's like I would hit it with the Bud Cups because they're so small. I got to water them many times a day anyways, but it's, if I were to know that number and I go, okay, it holds only 60%, 20% of the water content that's in that cup, if it goes down 20, I want to give it enough to fill that 20 plus 10 more every time if I'm doing short throughout the day, and to try to keep it in there. And that would be, instead of going down 100 or 200, it would be like 40 or whatever. Like that's probably the math I should be trying to figure out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And again, it's just the big thing is you don't want your plants to dry down way too much, because then the roots start dying, right? They dry out, that'll slow them down. If you keep them way too wet, you kind of have the same thing, right? They start suffocating themselves. They're not doing what they need to do. So it's kind of really allowing those roots to basically get that kind of moisture kind of uptake, and then almost like a breather. You know what I mean? Let that oxygen kind of resaturate that and then bring it up again. And it's just that happy medium, so the plant just really starts thriving and like really starting to push hard.
Yeah, man. I also noticed, I listen, and this is only my second run with these drippers and these bud cups, and it's looking good, but my system is not like, I have this big pump and it comes out at 5 mils and it's trying to dial it in too. So I do have to water a little bit extra for the far plants to get to that sort of percentage of runoff I want. And these are the ones, well, I guess it's waste, right? Because I'm putting it out, I'm just draining it at that one point, right? Like, and that's how I got to do it. So again, I think I've got it dialed in. But if you were to look at that number that I have, right, that top number that's super saturated, and I go and I want it again, the number would be 20% dry back, and then so that 20% of 3 whatever is X amount of grams. So once it dries back that percentage, I just hit it again, a little bit extra on both plants, and then down again, hit it again, down again, hit it as many times as it could go through the day. At the end of the day, should I be hitting it with more just to flush out that day's worth of little ones all the way through, just in case I didn't get enough?
Yeah, so I think what you want to do, and again, the biggest thing is that a lot of people do is, especially kind of in the evening, they'll be like, oh, my plant was really dry, I'm just going to really saturate it up so that it'll be good overnight. The big thing is that the plants stop using water as soon as your lights go off. So you want to make sure that you don't water really close to lights off, because you're going to get more likely to have like root rots and other kind of things play into effect. So ideally what you want to do, and again, it's a feel and over time as you get to know the grow, is again, we're looking for that same kind of 20% dry back, that you got to find out at what point do I water that kind of before the lights go off, that when it comes up in the morning that the lights come back on, I'm around that point. So that way you're not over watering at night and kind of drowning those roots as the plant's essentially sleeping.
And that's perfect, right? And that's what this is what we got to in our bro science the other night with a bunch of us talking about it. Except for you're right, to judge that time. Okay, it's here, it's there, but that one, or you do it like where do you, because I'm always scared of that buildup, right? Like of doing it not enough. And like I said, I've been doing 20% runoff every time, no matter what it was, and that's all I did, right? And the plants were really healthy, but maybe it could have been a little bit more healthy, right?
So again, a lot depends on the size of the pot, right? So again, if we're looking at the bud cups, we're at a lot smaller volume. So if you are going to really try and push like small amounts of irrigation, you do probably want to get a bit more runoff, because you want to say as that root starts filling up that kind of space, you're going to need to add more water, because the roots are now taking up some of that soil space that would have been kind of allowed for air. So again, when you look at, it'll be interesting once you pull out these cups, cut off the stem and weigh the whole thing when it's dry and see how much of that additional weight now is roots on top of the soil that you started with, because that will fill that space. So as your smaller pot, you do want to maybe aim for a bit more runoff, especially kind of around midday, not necessarily on the very first irrigation, but around midday, just to kind of allow that to flush out any of the extra salts that are slowly building up, and make sure that you are kind of at that saturation point that you need going forward.
Cool.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, when you did your 16, or how many plants did you do?
24.
24, right?
You had to outdo me.
Yeah. Did you get the roots to grow fully and like to the point that the water wasn't even going through the plant anymore or through the soil? Did it get there?
Yeah, it definitely was, and I'm just going to get a picture, because I do have a picture on my phone. It's kind of,
because when I did my global grow cut plant, it got to a point maybe like 4 to 6 weeks before the plant finished that I would start watering it. Oh yeah, you got tons too. Yeah, they're just white on the yeah.
Yeah. So like this one's more, and it was a healthier plant, and some of the other ones over there,
They had more
they're
space,
not as much, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
But
so
it's
mine,
a lot
I
of them are
would
like
water
full.
like I would water for 10 seconds. The water would build up on top and start like just falling out, and that would have to stop. And then it would take so long for that water to go down, and then only then you could add a little bit more. So I was feeding my plant 24 hours a day because it was every hour for 10 seconds, because that's as much as I could get without the water like splashing off.
Man, I don't think you can do the Bud Cup grows in anything but cocoa. Like,
Yeah,
it's
I think
just,
so.
I don't know if it's gonna work.
Listen, what I was doing for that, when you're right, these ones, the clones that got this big, and some of them had about 2. One of them, medium-sized one, was about 2 dry weight, and then the rest of it was 10.5 wet. So there was good ones, there was smaller ones, whatever. But it with the one my wife had, she had the same problem. Drip, drip, drip. It was full. It would go down. Drip, drip, drip. It was full. Drip, drip, drip till it was full. So it may take 40 minutes to get it to go to the runoff. But I would do that for that one. That's how she had it set up. 40. I think it was like 40 seconds or 40 minutes to get the whole thing, and then it would stop for a little bit, and then it would start again. So I don't remember the time schedule it was at, but a whole lot of small ones.
Imagine having to hand water that.
I know, right? Oh, yeah.
No.
I even tried
Scott,
getting a steak and
there's-
like making some holes in there, but it was so dense that the steak wouldn't go into the root ball. It was
It was
crazy.
dumb.
Yeah.
I remember pulling my stakes out, and there would be pieces of root that grew through the
Little holes.
things that you stick in. Yeah, it was crazy. Like, they're just trying to find as much room as possible. But one thing I would like to touch on here briefly is, Scott, I know you do deep water culture. You have a setup at home. Like, what's the big difference if you're switching from one of these other mediums to DWC? Obviously the equipment, but on watering and feeding specifically.
So deep water cultures, it's a really, it can be a very set and forget kind of system. Typically, you can just buy a typical 5-gallon pail. You can buy a net pot from a grocery store that fits on top of a 5-gallon pail. They come in kind of really large ones or kind of smaller 6-inch kind of openings that have a net pot in it. The big thing is you're going to use some sort of substrate in there. So typically people will use like LECA, the light
Clay balls or
expanded clay
something?
balls. There's
Yeah.
different brand names that are out there for them, but they're basically the orange balls of clay. They don't absorb any water. They're basically just there to hold your plant and kind of support that plant as it grows. So what I found best for deep water culture is, depending on what you're going to do, if you're going to start a clone, if you're growing, say, in an aeroponic cloner for your clone to start with, you can pretty much go directly into that net pot, make it so the roots are touching the bottom so it can go down. But if you're going to be going from, say, a Rockwool starter plug that a lot of people typically use, what I find works best is if you put one layer of the LECA or hydrogen or whatever you want to call it across the bottom. So just one kind of layer of balls, and then set your block on there. And then when I'm setting my water level underneath that, when I'm first filling it, I want to make sure that it's sitting about this much below the actual net pot that's hanging down. So my air stone's going to be bubbling up, and that's going to create a little bit of a mist that's going to kind of keep those hydrogen balls damp but not wet. So this way my rockwool doesn't get fully saturated and kind of rot out my plant while I'm waiting. Those roots again are going to be looking for that water, so they sense that water on the balls, and they're going to slowly come down and get into that water. So I find that's kind of the best way to start a plant in a system like that. When we talk about deep water culture in general, because the plants are just sitting in water, we really want to make sure that our pH specifically stays in a proper range. So typically what I'm aiming for with the deep water culture is somewhere between 5.6 and 5.8. So again, if you're growing in something like a coco coir, you might be going around a 5.8 in that kind of range anyways. But if you're coming from a traditional soil grower, you're typically going to go a little bit higher at a 6.1, 6.2 kind of pH. So pH is a big thing. You want to make sure you have an air stone in that bottom reservoir. So again, we're creating that oxygenation of that water all the time. One of the areas that I see people struggle with sometimes with the deep water culture is if you have it in a grow tent, the water that is in your tent will eventually become typically the temperature of that tent. It's going to pick that up. So as the water gets warmer, it can hold less oxygen. So you really want to make sure that you have that air stone in there. And where you see a lot of root diseases come in is when, say, your tent got up to 30 degrees because it's not kind of exhausting out that heat fast enough. Your water's likely around 30 degrees as well. So if you are going to grow in it and you are dealing with higher temperatures, I would add a little bit of hydrogen peroxide or something like that to the water, at least once every couple days to once a week, just to make sure that any soil-borne stuff or waterborne pathogens, sorry, that could be growing in there just gets sterilized, and it kind of keeps that area clean. When we talk about going for the fertilizer concentration, again, the big thing I see with home growers specifically is there's a big well, I don't want to say misconception, but a lot of feed charts that you see coming from these grow stores come in parts per million to mix these things. I would say what people want to be striving for is using EC or electrical conductivity. The main reason for this is that when we look at parts per million, when we're using an electroconductivity meter in your water to dose your fertilizer, things like that, is that all of the conversion factors for parts per million start from an EC value, or electrical conductivity. So what the electrical conductivity is doing is basically saying how much electricity can this water hold? And as we add more salts, it can hold kind of more electricity overall. When we look at parts per million, it's all converted from electrical conductivity to start with. So a lot of this varies kind of geographically. So if we look at kind of US, and I'd say Hanna Instruments is one of the big ones that people will buy kind of EC meters and stuff from in the US made. They use a conversion factor based on sodium chloride. So it's actually a 1 EC equals 500 parts per million. But if I look at using something, say a Blue Labs, which a lot of people use as well, it's kind of on an Australian side, and they typically tend to use a different conversion using potassium chloride. So their EC of 1 equals about 700 parts per million for the same thing, because it's a different conversion factor. So when we talk about feed charts, and it's one of the things that really bugs me, is that, you know, what 1,000 parts per million, depending on the sensor that somebody's using, you could be plus or minus like 300 parts per million above or below what you think you're feeding. So since they're all converting from EC initially, let's all just kind of work towards, let's start with EC. And now I can talk to anybody across the world and we're all using the same thing. So that's kind of
That's
my
very
big takeaway
interesting
with
because
fertilizers.
yeah. Well, H and I used the Blue Labs one, and I was actually just gonna say, like, isn't it a linear conversion anyways? But it depends on how they want to do that. So for the people who have been lucky enough to grow good weed without learning about pH and EC, take a little dive into it. pH is obviously very important for the nutrient uptake, and then the EC is the amount of nutrients in there. If you're too low, your plant might not be thriving. If you're too high, you could get, lockouts or burns and stuff like that. But when you said the DWC is kind of a set it and forget it system, as long as everything's dialed in, like how often are you checking your pH for that? Are you leaving your pen in the actual tank and it's just kind of always readily available to take a look at? And how often would that fluctuate if you don't run into any, unknown problems?
So really the big thing with the deep water culture is that the plants grow very vigorously. I would say out of all of the different kind of methods of growing, it takes a little bit longer to start that plant off, but once it gets established, they kind of go gangbusters. So the analogy I usually use is that if you have the roots, they're sitting in a full optimal fertilizer solution, your plant roots are essentially at a all-you-can-eat buffet. Take what you want when you want it, and it's always there. They're not searching for anything. They're just can feed. So because that, you get a lot of vegetative growth, things go really quickly. And I think when people talk about training, again, using bud clips and things like that, when you're using a deep water culture, they are growing a lot faster. So I find you fill that space a little bit faster, and people have a tendency to overshoot and be like, oh, well, I'll just train it out to the full size of the tent and then I'll flower it. And then all of a sudden the tent gets ridiculously full and there's no space for anything.
That's reminding me of our friend Anthony H.
Yes, I know.
So typically, what I'm aiming for with the deep water culture is I'm going to be looking, typically I'll start somewhere between an EC of 1.8 to 2. For most plants, seems to be kind of a happy medium. They work pretty well that way. pH, again, I'm leaning for 5.6 to 5.8. You'll find overall that as the plants start drinking water, that will fluctuate your pH, and things will, ideally your salts will kind of get a little bit more concentrated because it's going to drink up water as well as nutrients. So you're going to have a little bit higher nutrient content. So your EC will likely go up as they drink water.
Okay.
When I first started with the deep water culture, I would check it every day, you know what I mean, like religiously, that I'm staying right on top of it. And depending on the system that you're using, it could be a bit of a pain to do, because if you're using just a standard bucket, you're going to have to lift that lid and lift that plant up to change that. If you go with a recirculating system, which if you want a deep water culture, I recommend recirculating systems. So what this is going to do is have multiple buckets connected together, and it's going to pull water through all of the buckets. And you typically have one external bucket that I'm going to now adjust my EC and my pH in every day, and I'm not lifting any plants. So the way I've built my system is I have 4 plants in my actual tent, and then the controlling bucket actually sits outside of the tent, and the water just pumps through all of these buckets. So if it's the middle of the night, I can change my EC, pH, whatever I need to do. So again, at the beginning, I was very conscious about checking it every day. Now I'll look at it probably every 4 to 6 days. Typically, it's more just watching the water level at this point, but I'm not as dialed in on it has to be this specifically. It is very flexible. And again, since it's that kind of all you can eat buffet, the plants will take what they need when they want it, and then not when they don't necessarily want that as well. So from a standpoint of maintenance, it's kind of the lowest maintenance we could probably get, but if things go wrong, they go wrong a lot faster. So if I let my bucket dry out, you know what I mean, because I didn't check it for 4 days and they're really drinking now, you're gonna burn out those roots and you'll kill the plant pretty quickly as well. So it's just
open up your bucket and then there's like an inch of water left and the roots are all out like that. But yeah, I know I mentioned Anthony because he was one of the first guys that came on and kind of showed us his tents, and very interesting guy because he'd try everything, right? So I think when we first saw him, he was growing in soil or cocoa, and then a couple months later he's trying DWC. And like you said, with the training, like we based our training off our knowledge and like our recommendations with bud clips, for example. We tell people leave them on for 7 to 10 days. The branch is going to hold their shape after that. But with DWC, it's like 4 or 5 days, like, and then that clip you could see is under stress because the branch has already filled in that entire space. And Anthony flipped late. It was still early compared to a cocoa or a soil run. Like he's like 4 or 5 weeks in and he's flipping the flower and the plant goes right through the tent. You remember that one?
Oh yeah. And the thing too is that his plant started off with a nutrient deficiency, so that wanted to overcorrect it, I guess, to went a little bit too far into veg, but it definitely you grow really fast. And I remember at Niagara College too, when I was a student there, we had our kind of like what was it called again, the master grower project, where we grew our own plant in whichever sort of medium we wanted. And I remember growing mine, I believe, in cocoa, but there was one team that grew theirs in deep water culture, and their plant was like twice as big as everybody else's. You know what I mean? So it was a very, very stark difference. There was someone who grew in just pure perlite. That didn't go, super crazy either. But yeah, it was interesting to see how big of a difference it made and how fast this plant just blew through the others.
Mm-hmm. So I've run different trials myself, and I find if you're going to run them side by side and same kind of veg time. So if I go for a short veg time, say I'm going 2 weeks, and we look at kind of the yield that'll probably come out and size of the plant. Typically, I see that the deep water culture is going to grow the fastest, then the cocoa coir. So deep water culture fastest, then typically rockwool, and then typically cocoa coir, and then a peat perlite is a little bit slower. They just seem the roots don't kind of fill out and they don't get that bulk going quite as quickly. So that's kind of my scale of speed of growth if you're trying to look at it, especially when it comes to training and trying to fill kind of your maximum growth space with a minimal number of plants.
No, absolutely.
Mike, can we see a DWC grow in your future?
I've already done it, and it's sitting in my shed, my system. I built it. I just like let's go 4. I put 2-inch pipe in between it. I made it so it could take it apart and clean it really easy. Each one was like its own little piece. I did it. It was cool, and it grew like snot. But all those good things you guys talk about. When you said, oh, if I let my bucket get low and the one plant goes down, when you got 4 of them connected together, all 4 are going down. You know what I mean? So just like they're going to get, if there's a problem, it's circulating through all of them. So I had a few problems that circulated through all of them. And I was like, you know what? That's a whole lot of work. And now I'm on Bud Cup. So
Oh, I'm
I
happy you
like
found,
it, but
yeah, well, I'm happy you found some happiness with the Bud Cups style because yeah, again, I wasn't, H can laugh at me for my video updates on my Bud Cup run because he's like, dude, you're being so hard on yourself. They look pretty good still, but it's like nowhere near what I'm used to with my 3-gallon grows. So I'm back in those. I just want to jump in quick here before we go too crazy down the rabbit hole because it's already 10 to 5, guys.
Right.
Like we've been
Oh, wow.
talking for 50 minutes straight here, and it's been really fun to hear all this great information. The chat is saying that things are very helpful and it's great information we're sharing. So I thank you guys for that. But let's just remember we have a giveaway to do. We're gonna do a big Bud bundle again, so that comes with all of our products: Bud Cups, Bud Pots, Bud Clips, Bud Huggers, and you can pimp your grow right before grow season here. We're going to do hashtag newts, I think is appropriate for today's episode. So if you're on YouTube, if you're on Facebook, or if you're watching from X, you can put hashtag newts into the comments and you can be entered into this giveaway for that prize. If you're watching from Instagram, there's only a couple people over there, but hop on over to YouTube, Facebook, or X and type that in if you want to get in on this draw. Just can't do it through Instagram. So we got entries coming in already. We got 12, 16 people are getting their entries in. So we'll finish up the episode by running this draw, and that's all I wanted to say.
Hey,
can
Scott,
I ask you
wanted
something?
to-
Oh, never mind. Go ahead, H.
Sorry, real quick question on this recirculating part that you mentioned there, Scott. So the bucket on the outside, the level of water there is always going to stay the same as the level of water of all of them, right? So
Yes.
you just have to look at your outside one, make sure that. So then do you let it go down to a certain amount and fill it up, or do you always keep it topped up every time you open it?
I wouldn't let it go much past, say, I'd say like halfway down is probably the furthest you want to let it go. So typically anywhere between half to kind of like 3/4 is typically where I'm going to keep it. Again, you don't want to go full bucket because then it's spilling over the top. And again, the big thing when I talk about kind of how full that is that we want to make sure that wherever you put your net pot lid in that you have, that net pot sticks down a certain amount as well. So you want to make sure that your maximum water level falls below that actual thing. Otherwise, you're going to be kind of submerging that whole stem in water that you don't necessarily need. So that's where I'd set my water level is get a bucket, fill it up, and then stick your lid in. And if the water's coming through the bottom, it's a little bit too high.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay. No, good to know. And some
I
people
get a
will put a
question.
water chiller too,
Oh.
right? On the bucket outside.
Yeah, some people put a water chiller
chiller?
on there. Yeah. So when you start getting in kind of the more advanced side and you start looking at really controlling that water temperature, trying to keep it around that 20 degrees Celsius or so, really to maximize that oxygen holding capacity, that's really where it comes down, and you reduce that disease pathogens going in your water. So again, if you don't have a water chiller, the best thing to do is a little bit of hydrogen peroxide in there. That will sterilize your water for you. It breaks down into water and oxygen anyways, so not harmful. Again, I wouldn't put a whole ton of it in, but just a
How
splash.
much? Like,
I'll
what do you
do
say,
some.
like?
I just kind of go by feel now. I just do like a little splash in the water, just a quick kind of, oh, okay.
Just a
And
hint. Just
just
a
a
hint
hint,
of
and
peroxide.
just do that a
Yeah.
little bit. And if you are starting to see any kind of browning on your roots, if you do that, you'll usually see within about a day or two that it's cleared up and you're good to go again.
Cool.
I have a bottle of 23% stuff because I was tired of mixing all the other stuff. But I had a water chiller in mine too, and in my bucket outside of so I had 7-gallon square buckets in the tent, and I first put the 7-gallon one outside, and I was like, you know what? That's not. I switched that once I got the chiller, and I got a bigger one. I think it was, I don't know how much more it held. 30% more, 40% more, whatever. And then I was able to put the chiller in one side and go out the other, and it circulated and got it pretty cool. So all the buckets at one point were the same, but not. But no, the thing I was talking about before, I had something weird. And I heard you talking about it earlier about stabilization of your pH and stuff. And I'm on a well, and I have really bad water. I have a softener, and I have a UV thing. I got a iron filter. I got the RO. I clean it down. My number is quite high, and I get it down quite low, 10, 8, 12, somewhere in that vicinity. It could be the wrong ppm though, but either way, it's there. And then what I do is I then put my nutrients in, and it's usually good in veg. I get it down to that 5.8, and it would stay at 5.8 all the time. And all of a sudden this time I was having some problems with these plants in here. I go, what the hell's going on? Boom, I check my pH because I know it's usually good. I haven't been checking it, got lazy, but when I checked it was super high. And I'm like, what the hell? So I brought it back down to 5.8, and then it stayed there, and then it was stable again. I'm like, what the hell? So I was curious, is that something maybe because all the fucking snow is melting around the area and it's picking up like different type of water at this time of year that it does in the middle of winter when there's no, thaw?
It could be. So typically what you'll see is kind of in water samples, a bicarbonate that's going to basically buffer your pH. So especially when you see with snow melts and things like that, the water treatment, especially if you're in city water, the recipe changes slightly seasonally because of the amount of water they're kind of treating at that time. So again, the best way would be to send out for an actual water test. But if you're doing it at home, it's one of those things that you just go by feel, and you do expect kind of it does change slightly seasonally. They don't use the same water treatment all the time just to deal with the volume of water. So especially with the snow melting, we're getting a whole lot more water in the sewer systems. A lot more water treatment needs to happen in those kind of times.
Yeah. TWC.
Man, I can't tell you how happy I am to be back in my 3 gallons, Mike. That was rough for me. I got so confident after my GGC plant had 3.5 ounces, albeit it was foxtailed like crazy because of the heat. But yeah, I'm feeling good. Again, we're back-to-back episodes where we've just had such fun that I haven't had time to do my plant updates. Totally cool with me. H was even going to do an update of his plants because we haven't seen your stuff in like 2 months now.
I know.
But we are probably
We'll
running
do a
out of
post
time
about it.
for that.
We'll do a post.
Yeah,
about it.
we'll save that for a post for sure. Let's get this giveaway going, and we can keep kind of chatting because we're gonna lose Instagram in a little bit. But I mean, I'm down to keep chatting away if you guys are enjoying this. I'm sure the chat is enjoying it. Guys, if you could show some love to not only this video with some likes, if you're not subscribed, subscribe, but also hit up Mike 420 Things, his accounts on Instagram, YouTube as well. We have 56 potential winners here. So good luck to everybody. And then, yeah, again, you'll get a little bit of everything of our product line. We'll just have you email hello@budtrainer.com with a screenshot showing that you're the owner of the winning account. So let's run that. 56 potential winners, and we'll find our lucky grower. Spanish Dre.
Spanish Dre, look at that.
Yeah,
wow.
consistent viewer. I think won something quite a while ago. We were notorious for repeat winners on the show, which
That's
I
right.
actually don't mind because it means that you're showing up all the time and participating. So Spanish Dre, you know exactly how to figure it out. Spanish Dre also has a growing partner who could use some new gear too. So maybe you guys can split it up. And Mike's showing off the From Seed Bud Cup grow now because the last time it was clones. Oh, and you got your outdoors in there too, eh, Mike?
Well, I had to reset my mother tent, so these are like cuts of my mother's that they were just outrageous. So I cut them down, started new mothers, and they're going to go in my mother tent.
Okay. Yeah, when you
Yeah.
get up to Mike's level, you have a mother tent, a flower tent, a veg tent, a clone dome, a full greenhouse out back. It's beautiful.
I don't know if you guys seen this one. This one was started off as 4. It had 4 leaves. I had another one back there that had 3.
That was your little mutant action going on there.
Yeah, the 3 one seems to have cleaned up. The bottom nodes are in 3s. The second one's in 3s, and then the top's in 2s. So
No, I thought you were gonna do straight 12-12, but obviously you didn't do that if you have your mothers in there too, eh?
So because the last time we talked, we were talking about doing male seeds and how they had to be a couple weeks ahead. I had to change my plan.
Oh,
So
because you are, yeah, you're gonna try some breeding. I forgot about that.
yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
I thanks Scott for that because that was a little bit, and it was funny. I was telling some people who were on a Discord, and I was like, man, this guy said, he goes, yeah, we seen the episode, and we're like, no, and they're like, yeah, and they were like, yeah, we knew that. I'm like, oh, okay, cool, sweet, yeah, I didn't, but but again, it's trying something new. Like you were talking about, Anthony was trying something new. That's I'm trying something new all the time, and I love it. So again, I've got enough medicine now that I can do it, and again, I'm having some issues and working through them. And like I said, there's my scale that I use to weigh them.
Nice.
I got them. Try.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
guys, this was awesome. We're gonna let Scott go. I have to go as well because I'm on babysitting duty starting right now because my partner is going. This was a pleasure. It's been like an hour and 2 minutes already. It's Scott. Thanks for all of your knowledge again. We really appreciate that.
No problem. Love to be on here.
Yeah, no,
Cool.
for sure.
Well,
Quick again, where people can find you for those who haven't found you yet on Instagram and whatever platforms you're on.
we figured this out painfully last episode. The dot Golem, not just the straight up.
Scott.Golem on Instagram, and that's pretty much the main social that I'm on. So check me out there. Post some cool stuff every once in a while.
Perfect. Very cool. All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in. We'll do this again in 4 weeks. Hopefully, we'll have Scott back again in the future. Mike, of course, always welcome. And yeah, that hour flew by. I hope it flew by for you guys too. And see you on the next one.
Perfect.